Imagine the roar of the legendary Katyusha splitting the sky above the Kursk Bulge, or the outskirts of Berlin in '45. This thundering salvo, which became the primary sound of the Soviet triumph, is firmly associated in the public consciousness solely with the genius of domestic designers and the might of Soviet factories. But if we were to freeze this newsreel frame and take a closer look at the chassis on which the BM-13 launch system is mounted, we would discover a striking detail. Beneath the formidable launch rails almost always lies the powerful three-axle hood of an American Studebaker US-6 truck. Moreover, the smokeless powder that propelled these rockets toward the enemy was to a large extent composed of American nitrocellulose, delivered across the ocean via the Lend-Lease program. This visual paradox, a Soviet weapon of vengeance on American wheels, flying on American gunpowder, perfectly illustrates one of the most secretive, mythologized, and fiercely contested topics in the history of the Great Patriotic War. The question of how critical Western aid was for the victory remains one of the most politicized, dividing researchers into irreconcilable camps. Let's discard the simple and convenient answers that various political camps have offered us for decades. Soviet official historiography stubbornly insisted on 4%, claiming that this was the share of Allied aid relative to the total volume of USSR industrial production during the war years. This figure migrated from textbook to textbook, fostering the belief that Western supplies were merely a pleasant but secondary bonus, consisting of canned goods and outdated equipment. On the other hand, a contrary concept gained traction in the West, that without American factories and British convoys, the Soviet Union would not have lasted a year, collapsing under the blows of the Wehrmacht as early as 1941. Today, with secret archives opened, we are obliged to conduct this audit honestly. We must lead the conversation in the role of military analysts, historians, before whom lie dry figures, supply ledgers, and maps of military operations whose outcomes were decided not only on the battlefields, but also on remote, lethally dangerous logistical routes. To understand the nature of the famous 4%, we need to thoroughly examine how this calculation was made. In 1948, the chairman of the USSR State Planning Committee, Nikolai Voznesensky, derived this figure by simply taking the total gross cost of all products manufactured in the USSR, from buttons to heavy tanks, and comparing it to the dollar value of goods sent via Lend-Lease, using an artificially low official exchange rate for the ruble. Naturally, the enormous mass of Soviet production easily absorbed the imports. But this method is disingenuous at its core because it completely ignores the law of bottlenecks. Imagine a highly complex aircraft. You can produce 99% of its parts, but if you lack the microchips for the onboard computer, it will never take off. The practical value of a heap of metal without the remaining 4% will be zero. It was precisely such microchips of the war that the Allied supplies became for the Soviet economy, covering critical shortages in areas where domestic production had been destroyed or was non-existent. Take the legendary T-34 tank, the steel fist of the Red Army. The heart of this machine was the V2 diesel engine. The uniqueness of the engine lay in the fact that its cylinder block was cast from aluminum, which made the engine both light and powerful. But where did the USSR get this metal in '41 and '42? The largest Soviet aluminum plants were lost in the very first months of the war, and metal production fell to a critical minimum. And this is where Lend-Lease enters the picture. During the war years, the Allies supplied the USSR with more than 300,000 tons of aluminum, while all Soviet production for the same period amounted to about 263,000 tons. This means that more than half of all aluminum used to build Soviet tanks and aircraft was of American or British origin. Without these imports, the Soviet aviation industry would not have been able to produce all-metal Yak and La fighters, and tank factories would have been forced to switch to heavy cast-iron blocks, which would have deprived the T-34 of its main advantage, its supreme mobility and power-to-weight ratio. But the metallurgical dependency was not limited to aluminum alone. Let's look at copper and tin, without which modern artillery is unimaginable. Making shell casings required brass, an alloy of copper and zinc. Making steel casings is far more difficult. They often jam in the gun breech when fired due to thermal expansion, disabling the cannon. During the war years, the Allies supplied the USSR with almost 400,000 tons of copper, which accounted for about 70% of all Soviet production of this metal. Artillery, the god of war, would have been mute without American copper, and the Red Army would have faced a severe shell famine. To this, we must add the supplies of nickel, cobalt, and manganese, alloying elements without which it was impossible to smelt strong armor for Soviet tanks. American additives directly influenced the quality of the armor plates that saved the lives of Soviet tankers in duels with German Tigers and Panthers. A similar situation occurred with aviation fuel. Soviet oil refineries could not produce high-octane gasoline with an octane rating above 95 on an industrial scale. Our basic aviation gasoline, B-78, had very low specifications. The Americans sent the USSR more than 1 million tons of ready-made, high-octane gasoline, grade B100, and huge volumes of special additives like tetraethyl lead and isooctane. Soviet specialists used these components for upgrading, that is, for artificially increasing the octane rating of their own low-grade fuel. Every second ton of high-octane gasoline that burned in the tanks of Soviet aircraft was either imported from the USA or created using American chemicals. Without this help, Soviet pilots would have had to fight with engines that detonated and overheated, losing speed in dogfights with German fighters whose engines ran on excellent synthetic fuel. Even Alexander Pokrishkin's famous Airacobras physically could not fly on Soviet gasoline. To deliver millions of tons of cargo to the USSR, the Allies had to deploy a deadly logistical operation along several main routes. The shortest and most dangerous was the Arctic route. Convoys departing from British ports sailed through the icy waters of the Barents Sea to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, becoming easy prey for German submarines and aircraft. In the tragedy of convoy PQ-17 in the summer of '42, only 11 of the 35 ships survived. But the Arctic convoys continued to run during the most critical period of the war. Another channel was the Persian Corridor. To make it operational, the Allies modernized the Trans-Iranian Railway, built ports in the Persian Gulf, and laid roads through the deserts of Iran. At specially built American factories in Iraq and Iran, Studebaker and Dodge trucks were assembled, which then drove under their own power across the entire Caucasus to the front. This route was long but relatively safe, ensuring the delivery of a huge quantity of automotive equipment. One must not forget the legendary air route, Ailsib, Alaska to Siberia. Along this route, Soviet and American pilots ferried combat aircraft from Fairbanks across the Bering Strait, through Yakutia and Krasnoyarsk straight to the front. They had to fly over remote taiga in extreme Siberian frosts, with temperatures dropping below 50 degrees. Dozens of pilots died on this route, but the air bridge operated without interruption, delivering almost 8,000 aircraft. Finally, the route with the largest tonnage was the Pacific route, connecting U.S. ports with Vladivostok. Along this path, cargo was transported on Soviet ships under the Soviet flag. Since the USSR and Japan were not at war until August 45, the Japanese fleet could not legally sink Soviet transports. This route delivered raw materials, rails, industrial equipment, and millions of tons of food to the USSR, which saved the country from starvation, while the Pacific Fleet carried out intense duty protecting the ships. Now let's look at how Soviet offensive operations developed in the second half of the war. The concept of deep operation, developed by the outstanding theorist Vladimir Triandafilov, required delivering powerful strikes to great depth, introducing mechanized formations into the breach, reaching the enemy's communications, and closing pincers, that is, executing a deep double envelopment of the enemy's flanks to encircle him. But this theory had one Achilles heel: echeloned logistics, the system of supplying troops from the rear to the front line. A tank corps that has advanced 100 kilometers forward instantly burns hundreds of tons of fuel. If the supply falls behind by even a day, the advancing vanguard becomes easy prey for counterattacks. The Wehrmacht encountered this problem near Moscow in '41, when its logistics, reliant on horse-drawn transport, physically could not keep up with the tanks. At the beginning of the war, the Red Army's vehicle fleet consisted of Gaz AA trucks and 3-ton ZIS-5 trucks. They were simple machines, but they had only one driven axle and poor off-road capability. During the Rasputitsa, when the roads turned into liquid mud, they became dead weight. The arrival of American all-wheel drive vehicles brought about a genuine technical revolution. The Studebaker US-6, with a 6x6 configuration, had phenomenal off-road capability and could haul heavy artillery through mud that would bog down ordinary trucks. The Allies supplied more than 400,000 vehicles of all types to the USSR, including nimble command jeeps like the Willys and heavy 3/4-ton Dodge trucks. By the end of the war, more than half of the Red Army's vehicle fleet consisted of imported machines, which provided the mobility without which rapid offensive operations would have been impossible. Let us imagine Operation Bagration in Belarus in 1944. Soviet troops advanced through forested and swampy terrain, bypassing the strongholds of the German Army Group Center. The offensive culminated in the defeat of the German front and the encirclement of hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers. Would such a speed of advance have been possible if the infantry had marched on foot and shells were delivered by 1.5-ton trucks and horses? The mechanized corps would simply have gotten stuck in the Belarusian swamps due to fuel starvation by the third day. It was American wheels that gave the Red Army the mobility which allowed it to conduct rapid envelopments and crush enemy defenses in the shortest possible time. Mobile formations could penetrate hundreds of kilometers deep into the enemy rear without fear of losing contact with their supply bases. But motor transport is only the middle link of the logistics chain, the main element of which remained the railroad. It was by rail that divisions, tanks, and shells from the Ural factories were transported to the front line. During all the years of the war, Soviet industry, which had been completely converted to weapons production, managed to produce only 92 mainline steam locomotives and about 1,000 freight cars. The country's railway network was operating at its limit, and the fleet of steam locomotives was rapidly shrinking due to losses and wear and tear of parts. The country was threatened with complete transport paralysis, which could halt the defense plants. And once again, U.S. factories came to the rescue, delivering nearly 2,000 steam and diesel locomotives under Lend-Lease, as well as over 11,000 freight cars and flat cars. Moreover, the Americans supplied over 600,000 tons of steel rails, which accounted for about half of all the rails laid in the USSR during the war years. Without this transport injection, the Soviet rear would not have been able to handle the colossal volume of military shipments. Now, let's look into the soldiers' mess tin. For an army fights as long as its soldiers are fed. By the end of 1942, the food situation in the USSR had become critical. The richest agricultural regions had been lost: Ukraine, Belarus, the Black Earth region, and the North Caucasus. The gross grain harvest had fallen by more than half. Millions of peasants had gone to the front, draft cattle had been requisitioned, and tractors were left without fuel. A severe famine began in the rear, while at the front, the life-saving rations were hanging by a thread. Under these conditions, food supplies under Lend-Lease became a salvation. About 4.5 million tons of food were sent to the USSR, including the famous pork stew, egg powder, sugar, flour, and vegetable fats. The Soviet soldier received a calorie ration that allowed him to endure inhuman hardships in the trenches, conduct forced marches in the frost, and fight battles. The import of fats, lard, margarine, and vegetable oil was of enormous importance, as the country had an absolute deficit of these. People's Commissar of Foreign Trade, Anastas Mikoyan, wrote directly in his memoirs that without American stew and fats, there would simply have been nothing to feed the army. Although, at the front, the cans of stew were jokingly called the Second Front. For millions of soldiers, this stew was a matter of physical survival in the frozen trenches near Stalingrad. Without these calories, the Soviet army would have faced a catastrophic loss of combat capability due to the simple exhaustion of its personnel. Hungry soldiers cannot fight. They lose concentration, get sick and frostbitten more often, and no willpower or commissar's orders can replace the calories in their bodies. And what was this soldier shod in? During the war, the Allies supplied the USSR with over 15 million pairs of army boots and leather boots. With the total strength of the Soviet armed forces peaking at 11 million people, this means that American industry literally shod the entire Soviet army. Furthermore, Lend-Lease supplied a colossal amount of wool, cotton, cloth, and ready-made uniforms. Without these supplies, Soviet soldiers would have had to fight in surrogate footwear or revert to bast shoes and foot wraps, which, in the harsh Russian winter, would have led to mass frostbite and enormous sanitary losses. High-quality American footwear preserved the health and combat capability of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the front lines. There is another aspect of the war: communications. In 1941, the command and control of Soviet troops collapsed in the very first days of the German offensive due to the lack of reliable communications. Divisions used landlines, which were easily cut by German saboteurs, or low-power radio stations without reliable power sources. To remedy this situation, the Allies sent the USSR about 1 million miles of field telephone cable and hundreds of thousands of telephone sets, including the famous American EE-8 stations. Tens of thousands of radio stations of various power were also supplied, which were installed on tanks and aircraft, enabling real-time coordination of actions. Lend-Lease gave the Red Army new ears and a voice. turning disparate units into a single, coordinated military organism. Thanks to reliable communications, Soviet commanders were able to call in artillery support in time and coordinate the advance of tanks and infantry. Let's delve into the sphere of the chemical industry. Any shell or bomb is useless if there is nothing to fill it with, and the Soviet chemical industry had suffered from the evacuation of factories. The Allies supplied the USSR with hundreds of thousands of tons of ready-made explosives and chemicals for their production. About a third of all explosives used by the Red Army during the war years were of Western origin. Without this infusion, Soviet artillery would simply have fallen silent. No less important was the supply of industrial equipment. The USSR received over 38,000 world-class metal-cutting machine tools. On these unique presses and milling machines, which Soviet industry did not produce at the time, gun barrels were turned, engine parts were processed, and aircraft assemblies were put together. Lend-Lease carried out a deep modernization of the Soviet defense industry right in the middle of the war. Let's consider the supplies of finished military equipment which caused the most debate. Initially, English light tanks like the Valentine or Matilda, in the conditions of 1941, had weak armor and narrow tracks. But there were other examples. The American medium tank Sherman M4, affectionately nicknamed MCHA, was popular among Guards' tank crews. It was distinguished by excellent optics, a radio station, comfortable conditions, and it did not burn as easily when hit by a shell thanks to its wet ammunition storage, where shells were placed in containers surrounded by a water jacket that prevented ammunition detonation. The same applies to aviation. Besides Alexander Pokrishkin's Era Cobra, excellent American A-20 Boston bombers, and B-25 Mitchell medium bombers with superb navigation equipment were supplied to the USSR, allowing for precise strikes deep in the enemy's rear. Let us dwell in more detail on the supplies of rolled steel mentioned by Marshal Zhukov in his Revelations. Soviet tank manufacturing experienced an acute shortage of thin, high-strength steel sheet for the hulls of light tanks and the armor of IL-2 attack aircraft cabins. Over 2 million tons of steel of various grades were delivered to the USSR via Lend-Lease. This steel was used not only for vehicle hulls, but also for parts of artillery guns and mortars. This also includes the supplies of technical fabrics and leather, canvas for tents and covering guns, drive belts for machine tools. For millions of people working in the rear for 12 hours a day and receiving meager grams of bread, American food packages were a real salvation. Egg powder and dried vegetables saved workers' families from dystrophy. Let us also look into the documents concerning Lend-Lease settlements to dispel the myth that the USSR paid for all of this with gold. The Lend-Lease Act had a clear wording. All materials used up or lost during the war were not subject to payment. Only the civilian equipment and surviving machinery that the USSR wished to keep for itself after the victory were to be paid for. In 41 and 42, the USSR did indeed send gold and chromite ore as so-called reverse Lend-Lease, meaning the shipment of Soviet raw materials and gold to the USA and Great Britain as reciprocal services, demonstrating solvency. But the cost of these shipments amounted to only a negligible fraction of the total cost of American aid, which exceeded $11 billion. The bulk of the cargo was provided free of charge, and disputes over debts for the surviving equipment dragged on for decades into the Cold War era, becoming a tool of political pressure. Naturally, such a volume of assistance gave rise to debates that continue to this day. The official Soviet position was built on downplaying the role of Lend-Lease. The main argument was that the main supplies came only in the second half of the war, after the radical turning point had already occurred. Indeed, in 1941, the volumes of Lend-Lease were minimal. The main convoys only started arriving in 1943 and 1944, and this is a strong argument for proponents of the Soviet version. The fate of the country was decided in the most critical months near Moscow and Stalingrad, when Allied aid had not yet managed to reach its full strength. We held on thanks to the unparalleled courage of Soviet soldiers, the Siberian divisions, and the harsh orders of the command, stopping the enemy with our own forces while Lend-Lease amounted to mere drops in the ocean. But modern independent researchers raise a serious objection. Yes, the Red Army held on near Moscow by itself, but the war did not end in 1941. Ahead were the hardest battles of 1942, when the Wehrmacht was rushing to the Volga and the Caucasus, and the Soviet economy was operating at its limit. It was during this period that the most acute shortages of gunpowder, non-ferrous metals, and food began. Without Lend-Lease, the Soviet defense industry might have simply broken down. It is one thing to win one defensive battle at the cost of extreme effort, and quite another to wage a total war of attrition against a Europe united under Hitler's rule for 4 years. Without Western raw materials, fuel, and transport, the Soviet economy risked exhausting its resources long before the advanced units would have reached the borders of Germany. The country's mobilization potential was not infinite. It is useful to look at the situation through the eyes of the enemy. In their memoirs, German generals constantly lament that the Soviet command possessed inexhaustible material resources, but what particularly amazed them by 1944 was the increased mobility of the Red Army. They saw endless columns of Studebakers and Dodges carrying infantry and shells behind the T-34s breaking through. German logistics, which remained largely horse-drawn, simply could not keep up with these deep breakthroughs. The German soldier marched on foot, while the Soviet soldier, thanks to Lend-Lease, became fully motorized. For the Wehrmacht, the industrial power of the United States, materialized on the fields of Russia, became one of the key factors of strategic defeat. German intelligence continuously reported on the appearance of new models of American equipment, evoking a sense of helplessness in the German command in the face of a giant coalition. There is also a Western point of view that presents Lend-Lease as an act of salvation for the USSR. However, let's admit it, Lend-Lease was never charity. It was a pragmatic calculation by Roosevelt and Churchill. For America, it was vital to maintain the Eastern Front so that the Soviet soldier would continue to grind down Wehrmacht divisions. The supply of weapons was a payment so that Western armies would not have to land in Europe against the full, unweakened might of the Nazis. It was a deal in which one side paid with steel and canned meat, and the other with millions of its citizens' lives. For every American who died, dozens of Soviet people gave their lives. And when, in the post-war years, the Allies began to reproach the USSR for ingratitude, it provoked fury in Moscow. Talk of American supplies as a decisive factor seemed blasphemous, an attempt to buy a great feat for dollars. This psychological barrier became the basis for downplaying the role of Lend-Lease in Soviet history. But what was the true assessment of Lend-Lease by the Soviet leadership without propaganda? In the 90s, materials from KGB wiretaps of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's apartment, recorded in the early 60s, were declassified. Zhukov directly told his comrades that it is now customary to say that the Allies did not help us, but the Americans supplied us with so many materials without which we could not have formed reserves and continued the war. The Marshal emphasized that we had no explosives, gunpowder, or steel for tanks and trucks, without which we simply would have had nothing to haul our artillery with. Similar admissions are found in the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, who claimed that Stalin repeatedly admitted in private conversations, "Without American help, we would not have won this war." Moreover, at the Tehran Conference in 1943, Stalin, during a formal dinner, gave a toast, stating directly that without the machines supplied under Lend-Lease, we would have lost this war. Let's conduct a thought experiment. What if Lend-Lease had ceased in 1942? First of all, the Soviet economy would have had to change its planning. The Gorky automobile plant would have produced primitive 1.5-ton trucks instead of tanks. Due to a shortage of aluminum, aircraft would have been designed only from heavy delta wood, which would have reduced their combat qualities. Without hundreds of thousands of Studebakers, the Soviet infantry would have moved on foot, and offensives would have stalled due to the impossibility of supplying shells. The war would have turned into a slow, positional slaughter with enormous losses, dragging on until 1948, and demographic losses would have exceeded 40 million people. But would Hitler have won? Most historians agree that the Wehrmacht still would not have been able to occupy the vast expanses of the USSR, getting bogged down in a guerrilla war. However, victory without Lend-Lease would have been a Pyrrhic victory, completely bleeding the nation dry and depriving it of its future. We have emerged from the labyrinth of archival documents and KGB secret wiretaps. Before us unfolds a grand panorama of the war, where the details are tightly interwoven. And here arises the main paradox that we are obliged to contemplate together. On one hand, the Soviet people bore the main burden of the war on their shoulders, paying an unimaginable price of 23 million, or, according to more precise modern estimates, 27 million lives. The Red Army stopped the enemy by its own strength when assistance was meager. But on the other hand, without American steel, aluminum, high-octane gasoline, boots, trucks, and food, the Soviet war machine could not have moved forward with the speed that allowed for the crushing of Hitler in 1945. Without this aid, the war would have dragged on, turning triumph into a demographic catastrophe. So what was Lend-Lease? Was it a fundamental pillar of victory, without which the red flag would never have flown over the Reichstag? Or was it a powerful accelerator of an inevitable triumph, saving millions of lives at the cost of Western resources? Or perhaps it was a pragmatic tool of the West, which bought the blood of Soviet soldiers for its dollars? Weigh all the arguments, compare the volumes of supplies with the feet of the defenders of Stalingrad, and make this choice yourself. Which version seems the most just to you? For true history is never black and white, and each of us has the right to determine the price of that victory for ourselves.